Were there any what would you say the most interesting bands that you worked with?
I mean, God, the most interesting to record creatively, the most interesting really was the Beta Band. That was another that I mentioned him before, Ian Lawton, who worked with me on the Ash stuff, and he'd introduced me to that band. And I loved that band. I listened to the 3 EPs. And then I got to work with them on a few albums after that. Once they came to Rockfield with another producer doing the kind of first album proper. And then I got Heroes to Zeros, the third album, I think it was. They were the most interesting, just their outlook. I mean, that one album I did with them there in the quadrangle, we did that. I just loved that approach of we'd have a blank canvas in the studio and we'd have a production meeting about how we wanted the drums to sound, whether there was going to be 2 drum kits, because they often did 2 drummers, what kind of guitar sounds, what kind of feel we wanted for the song. And then we would set up around that, and they would come out with crazy ideas like it needs to sound like 1,000 slaves dragging a statue across a gravel or whatever, and we'd actually go and find an old plough and we'd drag it across the stones in Rockfield's courtyard. Or I remember once it was like, we need a really kind of weird, tubey, echoey drum sound on this. It's got to sound really kind of weird and a bit muffled. So I didn't mic up the drums. I mic'd up the drum cases, which was all kind of sat around the drums. So I put them near, kind of one near the bass drum, one near the snare, one in kind of stereo position either side of the kit. And so how we worked on album 3, which is the second album proper, if you count the first 3 EPs as the first album, then it was album 3. So we'd have the reason they were kind of so creative and kind of, it was a bit different and exciting, they just worked differently really. So what we would do is we'd have a production meeting on how we wanted the track to go. So the studio's a blank canvas at this point, whether we do the drums outside, whether we do them in a cupboard, whether we do them in the drum room, in the dead room, whether there be 2 drummers, 3 drummers, what was going to be on there, what kind of samples, what kind of feel it would have. And that would be the production meeting, basically building a picture up of how the track was going to be. And then once that was decided, we'd go about setting up then. And we might have decided that, the drums should be outside and we'd set up outside, blah, blah, blah. Or they might say the drums need to sound really hollow and like they're kind of muffled. So what I did once, rather than just putting the old tea towels on and put them in a dead room, I put them in the big drum room. Instead of miking up the drums, I put the drum cases, which were kind of all scattered around the drum kit. I kind of put one in front of the bass drum, one underneath the snare, 2 either side in like a stereo, and I put the mics inside the drum kit. So that they were kind of in front of the instruments roughly, but they was inside drum kits to try and get that really kind of muffled sound. It was just something unique really, because they were all about creating their own unique sounds and their own unique samples rather than just using samples. Let's create them. And then I had this idea that I could push the pool table that was in the big drum room there at Rockfield in the quadrangle in front of the drum kit. So literally pushed it right in front of the bass drum. And my idea was that especially the bass drum would shoot up the hole where the whiteboard would come out. And I mic'd up all the pockets with 57s, so I got 6 57s on the pockets. And my idea was that you'd get some kind of flutter echoes and some kind of weird kind of hollow kind of ambient kind of reflections in there. And it worked amazing. So that mixed with the drum mics inside drum cases and the pool table mic'd up, pushed in front of the kit, these 6 57s. And then I had a stereo ambience in the room as well, 87s, just to capture that room of his actual kit. And that was I can't remember which song it was on the Heroes to Zeros, but that was the drum sound for that song. So it was about creating these unique sounds. So it was like really taxing, because it was like, we couldn't just pull sounds off the internet or from sound libraries or anything. It was, how can we create this? The sound of dragging something, a big rock across the stones, getting a plough and recording that and recording it like 80 times or whatever, so we could really build it up so it sounded like 1,000 slaves. It was, really interesting and as an engineer, like demanding, but really interesting to do. And so we would do get the backing track done then, and all the guitars and the bass and the kind of guide vocal and everything. The backing track would be done. That would be day 1. And then we'd go into day 2, which would be overdubs. And they had this way of working where they would go off to their own little station. So I guess it's like working nowadays. We work remotely. So someone's in America working on guitars, you're in Ireland, say, doing the bass. I'm doing the mixing, everything in production in Spain or wherever, or in Wales. So it's kind of like that. They'd be off in their own little part of the studio, and they'd have their own workstation, which involved, I think, maybe a little M-box or something back in them days, if it was even that then. And they'd have their Akai samplers, they'd have record decks, they'd have cassette decks, they'd have their instruments. So like Robin would have like his trumpets around, and they all played a lot of instruments, so that they would have all these instruments around and percussion, and they'd sit and work on the track individually, not really knowing what the other person was doing apart from stuff that we discussed in the production meeting, which I found amazing, that they put in parts down not knowing what the other guy's putting on it, and there'd be samples from old films that they were famous for, and their kind of beats and stuff would come in. So they'd all have the track that we recorded the day before on their on their computers, and then they'd just be overdubbing to it and layering it in. And then what they would do is bring it into me, which became known as the hub. So I was the central hub in the studio. They'd bring all their parts in, and I'd have to kind of make them work together. And it would kind of be like the first time they were each hearing what they'd done on top of this track. So the buzz was, oh, what has he done? What's John put on this? What are we going to get here? And it's distorted bass coming in, and then extra drum things coming in, and samples of old records. And it's amazing, just making it work, really creative. So guests kind of like working remotely now, although people tend to know a bit more about what each other's doing. And they'd bring it in, and I'd kind of make it all work, and we'd kind of slot it all in, figure out together what worked and what didn't, maybe redo some bits. And then we'd get the vocals down, Steve would lay loads of harmonies, and we'd work on effects and all that. And then that would be the song recorded after the end of day two. All high five, all have a pint, go down the pub, whatever we did. And then drive across golf courses. And then day three we would mix it. So we'd spend the day mixing, they'd sit with me for a while, then they'd go off maybe to the pub or to whatever, and sit in the other room, and then I'd carry on, and they'd come back in the evening, we'd kind of finish the mix off together, really holding on it, and that was it, finished. Day three. So you just created this piece of art from start to finish, the pre-production, the backing track, the overdubs, the mix, and that was it. That song then is then put out of your mind, it's gone, and we break the studio down. It's not like we leave everything set up so we can, everything had to be different. So the studio would get packed down. It's a blank canvas again. We'd start again, production meeting, and exactly the same method for the next song, and build that track. And you're only ever thinking about one song at a time, which is really nice as a producer and engineer. And you're really getting a unique kind of sound. Some people say, oh, but it's nice to have a thread on the album where it's the same drum sound or it's the same guitar sound. But that wasn't them. They were all about treating each song individually as a separate piece of art. But because they had such a unique way of doing things, and individually their personalities always came across on records, I still think that their albums have a thread and like a common theme and sound. They don't sound disjointed. They sound like a body of work because they have these strong personalities and that sound and the way they do things and the grooves that they use, like using the MPC 66% swing, which is a kind of a classic beat band thing, which is still used today, actually. I think I've showed you that. Yeah, so they had that, and then they had that strong identity anyway. So then we do 2 songs, so 3 days the first song, 3 days the second song, Saturday night, everyone out the pub, levered, Sunday, hangover, chill out, day off.